So y'all can see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Sanchita, I did the up down button, but it wasn't moving. Should I do something? Just hit enter or to change the
Yeah. No, I can see your screen perfectly. I don't think you need to change anything.
Right, but I mean to advance the slides.
Or you can just press the right arrow. Should be good.
All right, neither work. Right, left, up, down.
Or you can just click it.
Click it. Enter doesn't do anything either.
Okay. Let me just check.
All right. Pay no attention to the man behind the screen.
That's what that guy looks like.
Yeah.
It's amazing the tolerance we built up for technical difficulties since March. So,
Perpetual, excuse.
yeah. I was doing a presentation last week and my internet kept going out and kept freezing up. So folks,
So I get a one-way.
Folks are fairly forgiving.
Yeah. Man, that's why bandwidth is just so crucial right now. There's a lot of reasons, learning and health, health delivery, healthcare delivery, all kinds of things.
Right.
So do I do something to make it go?
No, you can just click it.
Click it.
David, you guys ready?
I'm ready.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. All right. 30
As soon as our technical producer gets back in her office, our co-host will be ready to rock and roll.
Those of you who are consortium members know that Crystal is always our technical producer for any of our events. So yeah, she's the one who knows stuff and I'm just the pretty face. So,
Oh boy.
I don't know. Again, that's all. Well, all right. I do welcome everybody who's here today. I see we have a good crowd today, and I want to welcome you to this How to Create an Employee Handbook webinar, and to thank the JERHR group who have been longtime supporters of the nonprofit sector in Guilford County and of the consortium. Those of you who don't know, they have offered discounted services to consortium members for some time, and actually have an offer with this kind of information that we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the workshop. This is our next to the last event of the year. If next Tuesday, I think the 9th, if you're free at lunch, Wes Daniels from the Quaker Life Center will be leading a workshop on how to ask open and helpful questions. And it's a really good executive to roundtable to help you have difficult conversations with board members and staff. It's open to executive directors only. So, and of course, there's no charge for it. So if you're interested, Wes is a great speaker, a great facilitator, so I encourage you to sign up for that. But today, we have our friends from JER HR Group, Graham Dail and David Philpott, who have done multiple events for the consortium. And HR is such a critical issue that we all want to know more about. And we have the experts here. So gentlemen, I'll turn it over to you and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Steve. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And on behalf of JER HR Group, we consider it a privilege to participate in these lunch and learn opportunities. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be covering the items that we believe are important to have in a basic employee handbook, one that is detailed, well-written, and up-to-date. We feel it's very, very important for all organizations, large, small, profit, nonprofit, to have these handbooks for your new employees especially, but for existing employees. We see the handbook as being crucial as a communication tool to communicate your expectations, your culture, your policies, in everything that you want to cover. Again, as Steve said, we are going to be recording this for future use. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to have a link to the white paper that Graham Dail produced that summarizes the data that we're going to cover today. It'll be available for you as well. Nope. That's 1 second. Nope.
Okay, are we live? You ready?
Go ahead, Graham.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or soon to be afternoon. But we're glad to be here with you today, and glad to be working with my colleague David Philpott, and we'll both be jumping in from time to time and talking about various issues as they come up on the slides. But for now, what I'd like to ask you to do is think about one question you have about handbooks, employee handbooks. And in the chat box, I'd like for you to write down that question that you have in mind. Just one question at the moment, but you can write additional questions later on. But write down one question you have in mind. And we have someone who will be monitoring the questions, and we'll cover the questions at the end of the presentation. I will remind you, though, that some questions that you have may be specifically related to your situation, to your agency, to your particular nonprofit. So we may need to call you or contact you after the class is over with and talk specifically about the question that you have in mind. So the questions that are generic, that is, that they can apply to any agency, we'll try to deal with, answer, and dispose of. But the questions that are specific to your particular situation will handle one-on-one directly with you. Any comments, David?
No, I think we'll move forward.
Okie doke.
So the employee handbook provides the basic information that every employee needs to know about your organization. When it's done right and correctly, it is very important. It gives your brand legs. It shows them what you're about as a company and organization. It's a very integral part to your employee relations philosophy, essential to your employee communications, crucial to your development of an effective work and culture, a key component to your overall strategic plan that you want to communicate and make sure your employees are aware of.
So to kind of follow up on David's point there, your handbook is your policy manual. That is, your handbook is the basis for your policy. Now, what we ask you to do though is if you're not going to follow your handbook, don't write it down. So it's critical that when you have a handbook, when you have a policy manual, that you follow that policy manual. Okay, David. All right, so what do you need to start thinking about as you are beginning the planning for your handbook? So there are a number of things you need to think about. The big thing though is that you need to think about the purpose of the handbook. Why do you need a handbook? Why do you need an employee handbook? Why do you need this written document that you're going to share with your employees? That's really critical to the development of your employee handbook. The next thing you need to think about is this is the very first time you're going to have a formal opportunity to address the mission, vision statement and of your agency and how you're managing the business. There's some other issues you need to think about as well, and you can see on the slide. You want the handbook to project a positive image of your organization because it talks about the culture you're trying to establish, your business culture, the environment you're trying to create for your fellow employees, your colleagues. The size of the handbook is generally related to the size of the organization. The larger the organization, the larger your handbook. The smaller the organization, the smaller your handbook. Keep in mind that it takes time and effort to develop your handbook. It's not something you do in an hour or two or an afternoon or even a day. It may take several weeks to develop your handbook. And all of these things need to be considered before you start writing your handbook. So, David?
I think one thing that I think Graham noted is there's not a one size fits all for a handbook. And no matter where you get it or how you produce it, you want to make sure that you've gone through the steps to answer all these questions to make sure you have the right information in there that serves your purpose. So your employee handbook should include a comprehensive review of your policies and procedures. That's really the key here is you want a handbook and a policy manual together. You want to have information such as your handbook disclaimer, your organizational philosophy, mission and goals, legal issues that you want to cover, standards of conduct, benefits, time and leave. All of these are items that are important that you want to cover. Compensation, your technology. If you leave the company, someone leaves the company, another area that a lot of handbooks neglect, the procedure that you want that process to go forward with. It's not a rigid, inflexible list. There is room there, and it does depend on the size of the nonprofit. Some of the complexity of some of the items would vary.
Yeah, and I want to reinforce what David has just said. It's not a rigid and inflexible document. Your handbook is a guideline. The guideline allows for management discretion. And why do we need discretion? We need discretion because every situation is a little bit different. And so management discretion then applies to the variables that could influence what's going on with your employee. So there could be mitigating factors, that is factors that tend to support less discipline in a particular situation. And there could be aggravating factors, that is factors that support more discipline in a given situation. So just keep in mind when you have a handbook, just like any other policy, that it's a guideline, it's to offer guidance to you, the management team, and your board of directors. It's to support what you think is fair and equitable and what's in the best interest of the organization, the agency, and of the employee. So you need to keep all of those variables in mind as you think about your employee handbook. David?
Yeah.
All right, so the next slide then talks about where or issues that the handbook typically tends to fail to address. Now, and I want to emphasize though that it's not because of lack of knowledge, it's because, or not because of lack of will, it's because of lack of knowledge. So, you know, some of the things though are the financial transparency of the agency. You know, it's been shown that transparency is very important to your donors and supporters. Also, another issue that it can fail to address is pay equity, gender equity of our pay policy. So that's really important in today's world in particular. Another issue that's important is inappropriate political activity. And you can actually lose your certification if you become more political in nature. And so it's important that our handbook address that as well. Another issue that is particularly in today's world is your technology policies. What do we mean by technology policies? We'll talk more about this a little bit later, but we're talking basically about your computer systems, your software systems, your cell phone usage, those kinds of things have to be addressed or need to be addressed in your handbook. And the final major area that's typically omitted from handbooks are your whistleblower protection policies. Nonprofits in particular need to have whistleblower protection policies in your handbook so that whistleblowers know that they are protected, and it outlines the details about how that protection should look. So many of our executive directors don't really understand how important these policies really are, and it's something you need to think about, including those policies in your handbook as well. David, comments?
I think Graham's right that there's important things to include, and now I'm going to speak about things that you want to avoid. The first consideration is to avoid writing a handbook in a style that implies that it is a contract, guarantees a definite period of employment, or infringes on the employer's right to modify any or all of the policies that are described in the handbook. The handbook should also include an employment at will statement that clarifies that employment can be terminated by the employee or the employer at any time with or without notice. So to include this, not to mess these opportunities up, you really have to have a lot of knowledge in what you're saying to make sure you say it correctly. So for example, when you're describing an employee, you would never use the term permanent. You would use a term such as regular. You want to avoid a probationary period, which gives the impression that once you're past that there is a indefinite employment beyond that. So we believe the term introductory period is much, much better. Avoid using terms in your discipline such as calls, for calls, just calls. All of those indicate that there could be a higher standard of error that before someone would be disciplined or terminated. Another thing to consider is when you're referring to pay, that you want to use the terms hourly or weekly or monthly, and avoid annual compensation or annual salary. You also, some things that come in that are said people want to make their handbook warm and fuzzy, and there's ways to make it warm and fuzzy, but you don't want to say, we look for everybody to be here till they retire, or forever and ever, and we treat you like family, because those kind of phrases, they're meant to be warm, can also tie your hands. Graham?
Well, and I want to point out one thing that David mentioned that's really critical to our whole employment process, and that is the term with or without notice. Obviously, we want people to give us notice that they're going to leave our agency. We want as much notice as possible. We also want notice given to us in writing, a letter or some other way. Sometimes emails work, sometimes they don't. But this whole term with or without notice is part of the at-will. North Carolina is an at-will state. That is, we can terminate somebody with or without notice at any time, or they can leave us with or without notice at any time. So we create this need for our employees to notify us in writing when they're going to leave, when they give us notice. Give us as much notice as possible, but at least 2 weeks. We create that need through our policies and our procedures and how we separate our employees. It was really important that we understand that just because we say with or without notice does not mean that we cannot require somebody to give us notice. So that's really important. It's important that we deal with that in our handbook, in the body of our handbook. David?
Okay.
Okay, so what topics do handbooks typically contain? Well, we write a handbook and it contains about 10 sections, but it could be smaller than that. The handbook doesn't have to be 10 sections. It can be smaller based on how big the agency is and what the agency is trying to accomplish. But the slide that we're looking at now contains the major sections of the handbook. The handbook disclaimer, the philosophy, mission, and goals, the welcoming, that would include a welcoming statement that from the executive director, the legal issues. The first section is our legal issues section. The second section is the standards of, the next section are the standards of conduct. This deals with employee behavior. What behavior do we expect employees to demonstrate as they represent the company or the agency in the workplace? The next section is benefits. What are our benefits that we're offering? And these are primarily oriented towards the ERISA-based benefits like medical insurance and dental insurance and vision insurance and short-term disability and so forth and so on. There's a section immediately following that that's our time and leave policies. So what do we mean by that? Well, here we're talking about PTO, paid time off, or vacation. We're talking about holidays. We're talking about leaves of absence for medical reasons. We're talking about pregnancy leaves. We're talking about parental leaves. We're talking about different kinds of leaves of absence that employees can take. The next section is our compensation policy, and this is our policies that deals with pay and pay schedules. And the notion there is that compensation, while it can be loosely related to legal issues, to the federal government, to state government, and so forth, it's important enough that it has its own section. The next section and the newest topic that we are including in our handbooks now are technology policies. And we'll talk about these very specifically in a few minutes, but these are the policies related to use of technology in the workplace. The next section is leaving the agency. What do we want people to do? Number one is how can they leave the agency? There's several different ways. There's voluntary quitting. There's involuntary separation. That is, we terminate somebody because they have violated rules in some way. There's furlough. That is, we are temporarily furloughing employees because our business is down. There's a permanent layoff, those kinds of things. So leaving the agencies can deal with a lot of ways that that people leave us. And what do they do when they leave us? What does that really mean to them? What does it mean to us? What are our expectations around that? And then the final section that we have is our miscellaneous section. That would include everything else. For example, under miscellaneous, we could have our safety and health policies, our policies related to representing the company in travel, business travel, texting while driving, those kinds of things, the right of the organization to conduct searches of privately owned vehicles and so forth. So those are the main things. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's a big list, and it is a big list. But again, the larger you are, the larger your handbook, and the more complicated your handbook, the smaller you are, the smaller your handbook, and less complicated your handbook. So you'll see that some organizations combine some of these. For example, benefits and time and leave policies could be under one section. But if you're in a large agency and you have several employees, quite a few employees, a dozen or more employees or so, then you might want to have two sections. So again, your handbook will depend on how large your agency is, what your agency does, how many employees your agency has, and how complex your agency really is. David, you have any comments?
I think that's good, Graham. What we're going to do now is we're going to get into some of the specific things that Graham highlighted. So all employees should have a handbook disclaimer. And you say, what is a handbook disclaimer? Why is it important? The main thing that the handbook disclaimer states is that there's nothing in this handbook that creates a contract for employment or alters the employment at will relationship. These are critical to your defense if you have any employment action against you. This is going to be a key thing that you're going to need. Again, we mentioned the probationary period. To avoid that phrase, and an introductory period is much more agreeable, a better situation. Generally, those periods are 60 to 90 days. Handbooks should include a disclaimer that the handbook cannot address every situation, that you want to provide flexibility for your management. Obviously, you can't describe every possible discipline situation that someone might be involved with. And so you want to make sure you have some broad categories that allow flexibility.
Well, and yeah, to build on what David has said, then I want to go to the third bullet. Don't limit at-will rights. What you don't want to do in your handbook is limit your at-will rights. You want to maintain the at-will rights as long as possible, and as comprehensively as possible. So you want to make sure that your handbook doesn't in any way limit or influence or affect your at-will rights. And you don't want to make any promises, or you don't want to make any statements that could infer a promise, could be used to infer a promise. So it's really important that your handbook disclaimer section address all of these head on and include statements that protect the at-will rights, protect the right that this handbook is not a contract of employment, and that does not guarantee any rights to the employee. All right, so the next section we talked about was philosophy, mission, and goals. And you'll see by the bullets on the slide, we mentioned several things that you want to include. Now, this philosophy can be very direct or very specific, or it can be fairly general and less specific. It really depends on what you're comfortable with, what your board of directors is comfortable with, and what your agency does, the type of work your agency does. So, but just keep in mind, this is the very first opportunity you have, you as an employer, as the agency that's employing all of these people, have to talk about what you do and who you are and what culture you are trying to create in the workplace. So it's really important that you consider what you want included in this section of the handbook. You want to have a welcome letter from the director that is positive, welcoming, and inviting. That is, this is, again, the first opportunity for you to formally welcome a new hire, and you want your letter to be welcoming and inviting and positive because you're trying to portray a positive image. You want your handbook to portray a positive image of your organization. And we mentioned already that it can be general or specific. It can be a general summary of what you do, or it can be very targeted, very specific about what you do. And it can even address some of the stakeholder benefits that that the stakeholders, the other stakeholders get out of the organization. So it's really a kind of a serious selling job. You're trying to sell your new hire on you and make them feel glad that they are coming to work for you and excited about working for you and happy to be working for you. So just keep in mind, this is the very first chance you have to formally talk about the agency and what the agency does and how the agency works. David?
Well said. Well said. You don't want to miss this opportunity to give a very positive impression of your organization and what you're about. So legal issues, this part of the handbook in general refers to summaries of policies and procedures directly related to employment law. It may also contain policies and procedures that are more loosely tied to legal issues, but items that you want to discuss. This type of item would include employee rights, equal employment opportunity statement, Americans with Disabilities statement, anti-discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination. You would want to describe your hiring procedures, which would include, if you do I-9s, E-Verify, criminal background checks, drug testing, those type of items would be noted here. Anything regarding the, political activity, access to personnel records, it's important to note that they are allowed to see them and how you want that process to be handled. Privacy, ethics, confidentiality statements. Graham has mentioned the whistleblower protection. Again, a very critical thing that some handbooks omit. That also that there's maybe an opportunity that you would have to inspect property, whether they're lockers, desk, that you want to discuss that, make that people aware of that. Anything involved with orientation and training.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, access to records. Now, we want employees to know early on that we own these records. And while they may see these records, we control the way they see the records. That is, we tell them how they can access our personnel records, what they need to do to access the personnel records, and how they're going to be treated. So this whole section deals with legal issues. That is, issues related to discrimination, issues related to treatment of our employee base. And so anything related to discriminatory treatment or discrimination due to race, sex, gender, well, sex and gender are the same, pregnancy, sexual preference, or marital status, all of those things need to be addressed in this particular issue. Okay, so the next section we're going to specifically talk about are the standards of conduct. Now, when we talk about standards of conduct, we're talking about employee conduct. That is, standards of behavior. What do we expect from our employees? What can they expect from us? So this section will include our discipline policy. Now, most employers in today's world have a progressive discipline policy, and that policy includes a verbal warning, at least one written warning. Some have two, some have one. Some have suspension, some don't, and then discharge. So we want to outline our disciplinary policy, the policy that we're going to follow in our handbook. But we also want to reserve the right to discipline on the first occurrence. There are egregious type behaviors that call for a separation or termination on the first offense. So we want to protect our right to do that. So we want to make sure that our discipline policy then has both sides of that equation. We want to specify our attendance requirements. What do we expect from employees regarding attendance and even performance do we expect? And how do we want that to look? How is that going to look to you, the employer? We want to talk about a complaint procedure. I call it complaint. Some people call it open door policy. And we want to give employees the right to talk to us on an open door basis. Now, they may have a supervisor that they report to, but we want to tell them what our policy is, what our open door policy really means to them. Again, we're trying to advocate for them and tell them what they need to do if they have a concern or a problem or a complaint. We want to describe our behavior standards, our standards of behavior. What type of behavior are we looking for? So behavior standards means that we give them some examples of acceptable conduct or unacceptable conduct, depending on how we approach. Our dress code, it would be addressed here. Any drug and alcohol consumption or screening policies that we have would be addressed here. And then employee assistance programs, and there are a number of those that are available on the outside that we can implement in our operations. So again, this deals with employee conduct, employee behavior, and the company's response to inappropriate employee behavior. Comments, David?
I think you're right on there, Graham. So we're going to move to the benefits section here. This is an important part where you want to get credit for things that you provide as an organization to make sure they know, because they cost you money, and you want to get credit for them. You want to describe the benefits provided by the organization or other of benefits that are available at employee expense. You would state about COBRA or state continuation of your medical, dental, life, accidental death, short-term, long-term disability, vision, any of those and all of those that you have, you would want to have a brief description of those. But the most important thing is you want to have a note in there that for them to refer to the summary plan document for specific benefit questions. You don't want to put in a lot of the details of the, for example, on medical, the deductible and the copay and the procedures that could be tweaked and changed from year to year that would make your handbook obsolete, and you'd have to go back in and change it. So you want to be very general that you have it, and but also refer everyone to their summary plan document.
Yeah, that's exactly right, David. In this section, you would include details about your defined benefit plans, your defined contribution plans. Most people don't have defined benefit plans now, like retirement plans, but and any ERISA-based plans would be included in this section. And it's very important, as David pointed out, any comments you make about these plans should address eligibility issues, because you're required to provide summary plan documents that are given to you by the carriers of your plans, and you have to pass those summary plan documents on to your employees. So you don't want to, first of all, you don't want to repeat information that's in the summary plan documents, but secondly, you don't want to build in obsolescence into your handbook by including things that change from year to year or frequently. And so it's really important that you keep in mind that this section should be fairly narrow, fairly focused on eligibility, and direct employees to summary plan documents that you're providing to them based on the carriers furnishing those to you as well. David?
Well said.
Okay, so then we get to time and leave policies. Now, you might be thinking, well, I just have one section in my handbook of benefits. I call it benefits. And that includes our ERISA-based plans, but it also includes our vacation policy, our holiday policy, our sick pay policy, et cetera. And that's perfectly fine. This is one section or two sections that are frequently combined into one section, particularly by smaller organizations. But these are, when we talk about time and leave policies, we're really talking about policies that deal with time away from work. And so in this section, we would include our vacation and PTO policies that we have in place. We would include a statement of what days our holidays are. Some nonprofits tend to give more holidays than for-profits, but and so we would list the holidays in our typically list the holidays in our handbook. And there are ways to get around some holidays that you might need to get around in. We would include our leave of absence policy, our leaves for medical reasons, our leaves for pregnancy reasons, for parental leave, and those kinds of things. And if we have FMLA, we want to include our FMLA policy, but that requires 50 employees. If you don't have 50, you don't have to worry about it. We would address sick pay and jury duty pay and funeral leave pay if we have those policies. We would address school leave policies. In North Carolina. The North Carolina School Leave Act gives employees 4 hours in a school year, that is September to May, June, where they can take off to attend to meetings at their school, at their child's school. And there are other leaves too, witness leaves, workplace violence, not workplace violence, but domestic violence leave policies. Educational leave could be considered, but you need to consider what leaves of absence policies you have and include those under time and leave policies. David, any comments?
It's really important that you get the details worked out. Say, for example, for funeral leave, who it's covering. Do you send flowers? Do you days off? Is it immediate family? Who the family is? Because once you've established that, you need to follow that practice going forward. Because I guarantee your employees will remember what you did for someone else if you didn't do it for them, and they won't ever forget that. So that's really important to get these things written down so you've got them covered.
And for funeral leave, it's really important that you decide, do you count the day of death as a day of funeral leave or not? I mean, very detailed considerations need to be given to some of these policies to make sure that you're being fair and equitable in the way you administer the policy in your workplace.
Right.
David?
Next, we're going to talk about compensation section. This is important that you want to address all of the pay and payroll procedures that your organization has and sometimes gets overlooked in a handbook. You want to define the payday. You want to define your pay week. It's important to define your pay week because at some point, someone's going to work overtime and you have to explain what that is, either why you paid it or why you didn't pay it. Job classification such as exempt or non-exempt, again, for overtime purposes. In today's climate that we were going through with COVID, with so many people telecommuting and working from home, you need to define that, who is eligible, when and how that process would go. So again, it's important to think of what you want to do there ahead of time. Things like time cards, time clocks, time procedures, everything involved with how you record their pay and how you pay them. You want to talk about those. Also, the deductions that you would have for federal and state and benefits. One thing that's just critical is you want to emphasize to never work when you're not clocked in, punched in to work. You don't ever want to give the impression that it's okay to work when they're not getting paid because they want to give back to the agency. There are ways for them to give back to the agency, but that's not one of them, because that can certainly come back to haunt you. And if you have knowledge, or you should have had knowledge that this was going on, you're going to be held responsible.
And to build on what David said about overtime, there is no such thing as compensatory time for non-exempt employees. Some of you may give compensatory time. You can change the work week schedule in the work week, but if you have a policy of compensatory time for non-exempt employees, then that could cause you problems. Another thing that we need to address in this section is direct deposit. Most employers are migrating towards direct deposit, and because it saves you money, it saves you time and effort of creating checks and the cost of writing a check. The payroll goes directly into the employee's account, and it's just a lot easier for employers than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago when we gave everybody a hard copy check and they ran down to the bank to deposit. But it's really, and you can require people to use direct deposit. Now, you might be thinking, well, they don't have accounts, they don't have this, they don't have that. Well, there are ways around that. And without belaboring that point, we urge you to consider that. Something else that I'm really a proponent for is telling people if their job is exempt or non-exempt. Exempt are exempt from overtime. That's what the term exempt means. Non-exempt are not exempt from overtime. That is, they draw overtime for over 40 hours in a work week. And so all of that needs to be or can be addressed in this section. Another important component for a lot of nonprofits are things like volunteering. So what if I have an employee who works for me and he or she wants to volunteer to work in a weekend at an event on Saturday? They're not scheduled to work on Saturday, but they volunteer. Well, that could be problematic. And you need to make sure that the guidelines are very clear before you allow employees to volunteer and not be paid to work for you on a day they're not scheduled to work, because that can cause you trouble and can create issues for you, the employer. If somebody gets mad at you and reports you to the wage and hour people, then you're investigated, and that can really be a problem. So, David, any other comments about compensation?
I think that's good.
Okay. Then we have our technology policy, and this is fairly new, fairly recent, but this is a section where we include all the details about technology. So what do we mean by technology? Well, we're talking about ownership of hardware and software. You own the hardware, you own the software. You control that. So you have the right to limit the use of that hardware and software. You need to inform your employees that that they have no right to privacy in the workplace. You have the right to monitor their use of email, their use of websites, and all that sort of thing. So, but you don't want to monitor their use of email or websites unless you do warn them in advance. And this is the opportunity for you to warn them in advance. prohibition against downloading software. I'm looking at the slide here. What you want to make sure of is that people don't download software into your system. And if you have a centralized computer system, and then people start downloading stuff into that system, that could be a problem for you. You want to describe your policy or summarize your policy about cell phone or personal phone calls. Are you going to allow them? There's nothing wrong with allowing them, but just keep in mind that people can have a lot of personal phone calls or cell phone calls, and they aren't recommended. Cell phones aren't recommended in a manufacturing area or in an area where there's heavy equipment running and so forth. And so you need to make sure that people understand what your rules are. Blogging on a personal website. So a scenario for you. My employee, David Philpott, on his personal Facebook page, he posts a notice about how bad we are as an employer, how cheapskates we are. We don't pay enough. We don't, we don't treat him right. We don't do this. We don't do that. And he criticizes us, or he criticizes another colleague on his personal website. You need to have language in this technology section that limits the right to violate your policies in a personal website. And that's a little bit tricky, and we need to talk with you about that if you need to do something like that. Your right to monitor email and the internet, really important. And the consequences for them if they access pornography or misuse your electronic systems in any way. What are you going to do? Child pornography, for example, or sexually harassing somebody by email. How are you going to handle that? What rule does it violate? Does it violate a rule? So all of those things are really critical for you to think about your systems, how your systems are being used, and how your systems can be used, and plan accordingly. David, any comments?
I think you're right on. One thing that often is overlooked in a handbook is leaving the agency. When someone decides to leave, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, what's involved with that, what you want to do, how you want it handled. And again, it's important to have it written down so you can use that as a reference, because if you want them to turn in a notice, how you want that notice to be handled. Do you want it written? Do you want it 2 weeks in advance, as soon as possible? It's important to talk in your policies about whether you pay or you don't pay for unused vacation or paid time off, PTO. In North Carolina, if you don't have a policy that says employees will forfeit any unused vacation when they leave, you have to pay it. So basically, if you haven't told them they forfeited, you're on the hook for it. You'd have to pay for any accrued time. And so that is a very crucial part of this section that you want to make sure on your vacation, holidays, sick pay, any and all of those things that you notate when someone leaves, how you're going to handle that.
Yeah, and really important, particularly for the last check. If you have, you do not have to give somebody a paycheck on their last day at work. As long as you pay them in your normal rotation, then that's legally sufficient. So really important that you consider how you want to do that. So any questions about, well, if you have any questions about that, just list them in the chat section. So the final section is the miscellaneous section. This is the catch-all for everything we didn't put in another section, we put in the final section. You may be thinking, well, so we talk about business travel. Why don't we talk about business travel compensation? Well, we can talk about business travel under compensation. So many of the things that we put in handbooks can go in multiple sections. So one of the decisions you have to make is, where do you want to put it? What do you want this to look like? So what I would suggest for the miscellaneous section would be your safety and health, like bloodborne pathogen policy, your hazard communication policy, if you use chemicals or work with chemicals. Workplace violence would go under there. You are required to have a written workplace violence policy, regardless of how large you are in your handbook. Texting while emailing or driving is against the law, against North Carolina law, so you have to limit that. You want to put into your policy that they have to pull over to the side of the road to answer a text or to email while they're on business travel. Another policy you could put in there is your weather closing policy. Now, that can also go under another section, but you want to make it where it's easy for employees to find. So your weather closing policy would describe how they are to be notified if you're going to not operate because of bad weather. You know, do they listen to Channel 2 news? Do they listen to so-and-so radio station? Do they have a call-in number where they can call you and check in to see if you're going to open the office that day, or whatever it is? So that's the idea. So David, any comments about this?
I think you're there. So we'll finish it here with just sort of a recap. So the employee handbook is a great tool for employers to communicate their plans, desires, goals, missions, everything that you would like to say that's either legally needed or as an organization, something you believe in. We believe that an up-to-date, well-written, detailed handbook is the single most important document that an employer can have. So with that, we've got some questions, and I'll also say, if you haven't had enough of looking at us, that's where we are. And one thing that's on this on this slide, there is the access to the white paper written by Graham Dail. That's that address that you can go and view it, and it gives a great summary of what we spoke of today. Additionally, if you have questions, you can also contact John Wing or go to the info@JER Group or our phone number there. And question.
Let's see, David, I've got a question here. Let's see, is there any information I should not have in the employee handbook? David, what do you think about that one?
Well, there are things that are very fluid. I would say that could change, that will change, that I wouldn't include in the handbook. I would look at this as an opportunity to make sure you've got things that everybody is comfortable with. Once you write it down, you need someone, whether it's your HR person or someone you designate as HR, to be the keeper of the handbook and to ensure that everybody follows it. Again, going back just something simple like a funeral leave, if whatever you say is what you got to do. And so if there was something sort of fluid, I wouldn't include that.
Yeah, and one example is the PPP situation now, the COVID-19 situation now. That policy, of course, was passed by the Congress in the spring, and it is due to expire December 31st. So that's fluid. It had a start date and it had a defined end date. And sorry, somehow or another I closed off the video, but and so that should not be included in a handbook. that's a good example of what not to include in the handbook. So another question here, does the handbook cover contract workers, 1099 workers? David?
No, that, again, it's employees. If they're a 1099, then they're not your employees. So you wouldn't cover them in your handbook and you wouldn't provide them a handbook.
And we need to be very careful about who our 1099 employees are, because what the state has a new law that the contract workers that we need to be aware of. And so I would urge you to call somebody about that or check with somebody about that to make sure that your workers aren't really employees. Your contract workers aren't really employees. Okay, let's see. How often should the handbook be updated? David?
Well, generally it should be looked at or reviewed every 2 to 3 years. If there hasn't been really any legal issues that have changed, or really if you haven't changed any of your procedures, there's nothing that you would need to update, but you want to review it to see if anything needs to be reviewed and updated.
Okay. Yeah, I always look it over at the end of the year, end of my business year. And if there's anything that jumps out and grabs you that can be easily changed, you know, you got to make a decision about whether you're going to defer that or not defer that. But the idea is it should be formally reviewed every 3 to 5 years, like David said. I think he said 5. And it should be informally or less formally reviewed periodically, at least annually in my mind. But that's just me. Okay, let's see here. And again, if you have any questions, use the chat box and we'll try to address those. Let's see. Should pay band levels and determination of salary increases be included in the handbook or as a separate policy? David, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I would say you would not want to really include those in there because they're subject to change. Either the rates will change or the bands will change. I think you would just give a general reference to it. You agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you can have an appendices to your handbook. And, you know, in other words, if I have a 20-page handbook front and back and Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3, I can change Appendix 3 and not change everything else in the handbook. And that's sort of the idea, is you don't want to build in obsolescence in your handbook by putting in too much detail. And because it really becomes difficult to manage the process if you do that. So, but it's a judgment call. You have to make that judgment on your own.
So here's a question regarding working from home policies. Graham, you want to address that?
Yeah, working from home policies, they can be a sticky wicket. For example, if I'm your employee and I'm working from home and I trip over my dog and break my arm, that might be a workers' compensation case for you if I'm working. And so you need to at least be aware of that. You also need to be aware of the conditions under which that person is working. If they're sitting at the kitchen table with the TV on in the background and they're watching 3 kids, maybe that's not really working. Maybe it is. It's just a real can of worms. But the idea is that we manage that process just like we manage other things, and we make people accountable for accomplishing work that they're doing at home, just like they're accountable for accomplishing work at work. So we have to try to figure out a way to do that and be fair to them and be fair to our donors and other employees as well. So it's a challenge. David, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did. I
Tried.
think we're basically out of time. I'm going to refer one thing that if you do have additional inquiries, you can contact John Wing at jwing, JWING at jerhrgroup.com, or call at 336-292-1911, and that consortium members would be able to receive a discount. And we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. We hope we didn't put you to sleep through your sandwich and lunch. And we'll turn it back to Steve.
David and Graham, thank you guys so much. This was incredibly informative. And we really appreciate it. And I do want to remind consortium members that JERHR Group does offer a discount in consulting services to consortium members. And you have John Wing's contact information to learn how to access the discount. And we thank you for your long-term partnership. Graham, I did notice that you look a little different from the picture. I see that you joined the cool kids and got
Yeah, a
the
little
facial
bit.
hair.
Yeah, I've gotten used to it now, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good look for all of us. So anyway, thank you guys so much. David Moff, I think I see you. Thank you again for being with us. And for all the folks at JERHR Group and from the consortium, hope you guys have a great holiday season, and we will see you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Wendy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.